Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I am your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we will be talking about the Indy Grand Prix at Long Beach. I had the best time. I actually got to attend the race, but I won't be recapping all by myself. I will be recapping with a friend of mine named Ellie, who I love. I think her content is so fun, and if you are trying to get into IndyCar, Ellie really focuses on IndyCar, which is great. You can find her on the internet, on all places, at That IndyCar Girl. So please welcome That IndyCar Girl to the podcast. Please welcome Ellie.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I can't wait to talk about all things IndyCar.
Thank you for coming on. I'm really excited. I think people know that I started watching Formula One first. So sometimes IndyCar, there's a little bit of a learning curve, I think, because the rules are so different. And I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast are Formula One fans first and now are really interested in getting into IndyCar. So it's been fun to sort of spread the world out. But I also really appreciate having people who are almost IndyCar experts on the show to talk about IndyCar with me.
Oh gosh, I don't want to be framed as an IndyCar expert. I feel like there's always something I'm learning. I feel like you're setting me up here. No, I kind of started the same way. I started as a Formula One fan turned IndyCar fan. I grew up in Detroit, so I've gone to a few of the Detroit races growing up, but I really closely started following Formula One first. And then I went to an IndyCar race in Detroit as an avid F1 fan and was like, oh my gosh, this is so similar. I had no idea. So then I engaged myself more into it and tried to learn everything I possibly could. I just kind of became a sponge and fell in love with it.
Did you find IndyCar specifically, you mentioned that you went to IndyCar races when you were younger. Did you have family members who were IndyCar fans that took you, or did you just kind of go to races?
Honestly, not really. So in Detroit, we're car focused. If you live here, you work for GM, you work for Ford, or you work for Stellantis. You cannot escape it no matter what. So there's multiple events outside of the race that are just huge for everybody in the area. So even if you're not necessarily into it, you still go.
So it's just like a city-centric thing.
It's just
That's
a thing.
Cool.
Yeah, it's just a thing. And we do Detroit, not to, I'm a little biased. I love the Detroit race, but they do a lot of cool things where you can have the free general admission. Friday is pretty much completely free. There's a lot of places that you don't need a ticket to be able to watch it, even during the race on Sunday. So we just kind of grew up doing that, and I just kind of fell in love with it.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed about IndyCar in general is it's a lot more accessible in terms of cost prohibitive nature, and also that it feels like a lot of American cities sort of become the racetrack for IndyCar. So it's a lot easier to get there. For example, I went to IndyCar this weekend. I was actually at the Long Beach Grand Prix, and my tickets for all 3 days, for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, plus paddock access for Sunday, and I had a grandstand seat. That was the cost of one day at a Formula One Grand Prix.
Absolutely. I think that's my favorite part. About IndyCar in general. It's not only is it super affordable to go to an IndyCar race, but the accessibility once you're there, you'll never experience anything like that.
Agreed. I think it's it's really cool, because I think one of the things that we've talked about in motorsports right now, especially as they're getting more and more popular, is as the demand is going up, the prices are as well, which is making it harder and harder for people to get to a race. And I think there are pros and cons to going to a race. To be able to recap this race, I had to rewatch it on after going to the race. And it's, you can't see the entire race at the entire time, but it really is the energy of being at a racetrack, regardless of what series it is just so unmatched that I wish it was cost effective for everyone to be able to go. And one thing I loved about being at the Grand Prix this weekend was seeing so many families with young kids at the track, being able to, see cars, be up close with them, watch the race, meet drivers, and drivers taking time to meet kids. It's just such a different level of sort of access and how close you can get and how excited you can be about the sport.
I agree. I think it changes everything. There's not many sports where that, sports in general, where that's a thing. So to be able to have that in IndyCar is amazing.
Agreed. Well, when it comes to IndyCar, just so everybody knows where you're at before we jump in, do you have a team and driver that you support?
I try to be open. I try not to have favorites. Try not to pick favorites. I say that like to my dogs. Try not to pick favorites. But you always have a favorite. There's just no way around it. I feel like across the board, motorsport, Formula E, Formula One, IndyCar. I'm a McLaren girl. I feel like I bleed orange. I'm not even lying. So, team-wise, I lean towards McLaren. I'm a big Penske girl too. When I first was starting out watching and learning about IndyCar, I really fell in love with Joseph Newgarden and Scott McLaughlin. Driver-wise, I would say that he's my favorite. I think not only is his racing really fun to watch, I love his personality. And I think he's very personable across the board, and he's just a great person to watch as you're getting into the sport.
Yeah, he shares a lot as well, like on social media as well. So if you're like the type of person who wants to connect with the person behind the helmet type of situation, I think he's a great one for that.
He's personable. He's fun. They have a podcast and a little YouTube series, I think, as well. And you just learn a lot about, them in general along with the sport.
Great. Well, I will say it's going to be a sad week for both of us as McLaren fans. As I like cozy into my Pato Awards sweatshirt that I got this weekend.
I actually love it. I wanted to say that I absolutely love that. I don't think I've seen that before.
It's new. It was new this weekend. I'm really into it. It's like if you're listening to the podcast, it's like it's the McLaren colors, but there's just like it's a slightly toned down color orange is what I'll say. It's not the bright papaya. So it's good for me.
I love it. I think it's awesome.
This is not a sponsored part of the podcast. I just spent my own money on it and really enjoy it. So the Long Beach Grand Prix, I was really excited to get to attend this one because it is widely regarded as like the second most important race on the series kind of calendar. The first is obviously the Indy 500, which if you're not super familiar with IndyCar, like you can enter just the Indy 500. It's the most important race. And there are a number of people doing that this year, which is really cool. So the Long Beach Grand Prix was kind of set up to mimic the Monaco race, which is why it's like this cool seaside kind of street track. There's 11 turns. The race is almost 2 miles around. It's like just under 2 miles per lap. And I was looking at the history of this race, actually, which I thought was really cool. It was first created in 1975. And as, this IndyCar street track meant to be sort of the Monaco style race. And McLaren CEO Zach Brown actually called it his Monaco, which I thought was really cool. He was talking to ESPN and he basically, I have like an actual quote for him. I won't misquote him, but he said, "I'm from LA. The first ever race I went to was the 1981 Long Beach Grand Prix, and I still have the race program. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was like, there's Mario Andretti. At one Long Beach Grand Prix, I absolutely fell in love with racing," which I love because Zach Brown has some of the coolest lore in racing, I think, because he went on a game show, used that money. Like, it was like, let me use this money to buy a go-kart, and now he's the CEO of McLaren Racing.
The most random upbringing in open wheel racing history.
But my favorite is that somewhere in there, he was like, I'm going to go to the Long Beach Grand Prix. And now he's like, this is it. This is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. And I'm going to do it so well.
Yes. And like you said, so well, I'm going to kill it.
Yeah. I think that is such a cool piece of lore that it's like, if this race didn't exist, who would be in charge of McLaren right now? Like, what a different world.
It'd be an entirely different world. And I think that's like an interesting segment to go into the whole, not necessarily reserve driver, but Theo coming in this past weekend. Like, where would we be in this type of world if Zach Brown was not CEO of McLaren, right? So I never would have guessed that Theo would have been filling in for that seat. You couldn't have put that in my bingo card. I would have never guessed.
I will say it was announced so late that for the first lap of practice, they actually had the wrong name on the board at the race.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah, so I don't know if it was on the broadcast as well, but during the race itself, on the timings, during practice 1, they had the wrong name because they were like, oh, that's so right. Teo was here.
That's bizarre. I had no idea.
Yeah, but I was really excited to see that because it is one of the things that I think McLaren specifically has an advantage of being plugged into sort of the world of the ladder of F1 and being able to pull people from that space into IndyCar, which obviously any team can technically do that, but because they have this easy connection between having a team in both spaces, I think it allows them to do cool moves like that. And Teo did a really good job.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to go off on is the connections, I think, between having, the Formula One team with the IndyCar team, that you're right, it does pull in those connections that the other teams might not necessarily have. And, Theo isn't even, necessarily the reserve driver for McLaren in Formula One. So that's just a whole nother cross section of connections that they have just being in the motorsport world. But I think filling a seat for David is kind of some big shoes to step in. We might not know what he can do in the McLaren car just about yet, but I think he has a lot of clout and a lot of people following him going into this seat. So, I wasn't necessarily expecting him to race this coming week. Like you had mentioned, it came out so late. I was definitely thinking in my turn, my eyes, I thought Callum was coming in and taking his seat for this last Grand Prix. I was not ever expecting Theo to jump in there, but the way that he moved up that grid was absolutely phenomenal.
Agreed. I really loved his drive. And also, like, I did get to see him in the paddock after, and you could tell he was like, hello, it's nice to see you all. Yes, I had a nice drive. No one else did. And I'm here to sign autographs.
Yes, I slayed this, and you're welcome.
Yeah, he is so tall. He's so much taller than the other drivers. I was so surprised to see him.
Yeah, I literally can't imagine. I mean, not only is it his first time driving an IndyCar, but being so tall and getting into that seat, I literally can't imagine. I had the opportunity to do a 2-seater ride at the Detroit race last year. So I was in an IndyCar, and I'm 5'7", and I was already cramped in that seat. So I cannot imagine his tall body being in that car.
Yeah, and I do wonder, since it was such a last-minute decision, like, if they had the ability to actually do a proper seat fit. Obviously, I'm sure they did. They know what they're doing, but
I mean, it was announced so late. So how late did he hear about it, right? We don't know.
Yeah. Though I will say, because you brought up the 2-seater, I have to point out one of my favorite weird things that happened at this race, which is that if you don't know about it, IndyCar does obviously a rolling start. And so they don't start from the grid like they do in Formula One. They actually like line up and do a couple of laps, and then the race starts while they're actually already driving at a high speed. And when that happens, usually what they do is they have a celebrity in a 2-seater in the front car that leads the first warm-up lap. And the celebrity this time was none other than Dylan Sprouse.
Snaps for Dylan. I'm a Disney Channel girl. I grew up watching Sweet Life of Zach and Cody. That was my thing.
Same. I was like, I cannot believe. And it was such a random thing too. Like, he came out of nowhere. It was not like highly advertised or anything like that. And then just suddenly it was like, oh, Dylan Sprouse is here to kick off the race. Great. Cool. Good to see you, buddy.
Oh, there he is. Wow.
But it is my new dream.
Oh, to ride in a 2-seater?
Yeah. To like in any capacity, I have to do it. It looks so cool.
Girl, I did it, and I don't know if I'll ever do it again, but I'm glad that I did it. I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I don't like roller coasters. Like, I like to watch it. I don't like to do it. But one thing I'll say, and I think, like you had mentioned, a lot of your listeners are coming over from Formula One and learning about Indy cars. You probably know that IndyCar has no power steering, right? So it's just them against the G-forces. And when I was in that car, in that 2-seater, I was going down the straight, and we had hit 170 miles an hour. And I felt like my helmet was wobbling. Like, I felt like it was about to fly off at any second. So I'm trying to lift my arms up to hold the helmet down. Like, I'm like, oh, me versus 170 miles. I can totally hold this down. I could not lift my arms up like past my shoulders. There was, I don't know. I'm also very weak, but I think the G-forces outweigh my weakness, and I could not get my hands up to hold that helmet down. So now picturing them holding that steering wheel is just, that's something I think about every time I watch a race. It's like, I couldn't even lift my arms up to hold a helmet, and these people are holding a steering wheel.
Yeah, honestly, that's one of the things that I think is so impressive about IndyCar is that lack of power steering, because the G-forces get so high and you are going so fast, and they are whipping that car around like through sheer strength alone. Like,
absolutely,
you got to really work on that upper body. It's wild.
Yeah, that neck has to be very strong.
The last sort of like pre-race highlight we have that was perhaps a sign of what was to come. We started off so strong for Arrow McLaren. Pato had the first, the top time in practice, in the first practice, and he was going in second in the driver's standings for the championship. And then it just like, by the time we got to practice 2, everything fell apart for Arrow McLaren. And it was a bummer, obviously, from our personal standpoint. But it's also, the thing about it is, I think it's such a point of like how little changes to these cars can make such a big difference, because there's only 2 engines. Everyone's working in equal powered vehicles. It's not like other racing series where like having more money means that you have a faster car or having more time or better engineers. This is really like, it's a car that you have the exact same engine across the board, or there's 2 engines across the board. And so you're racing very equally. And so the things do shift very quickly. And so these small changes that you're making to the car really do push performance in one direction or the other, but in an extreme way, as we saw with Pato and with the rest of Arrow McLaren this weekend.
Yeah, I think that's something really important to touch on, mostly for, newer fans, is they are pretty much using almost the same exact car across the grid, right? Like their engines are pretty much exactly the same. No, the engines are exactly the same is what I should say. But like, yeah, one minor tweak. And I feel like that's also not super common that we see in IndyCar race weekends. I feel like it's pretty common to know, once you watch those first few practices, that's pretty similar to what at least qualifying is going to turn out to be like. So it's pretty interesting to have watched that, Pato was leading in those first few, and then they changed one little snippet and it changed everything for him in the race.
Yeah. And then obviously I think we'll dive into the race now, because as we know, for everyone but Teo, who had never raced an IndyCar before, on the McLaren side, it was not a good weekend. We had a small, not very small collision for very much Pato's fault. He's taken responsibility for it, but he drove into the back of his teammate with Rossi and completely destroyed both of their races. It was just, that was the end. There was no way for them to catch back up from there. I watched Rossi come in and I was like, this is so devastating. Like, you guys have been out for like 4 seconds and then they're coming in, doing a pit stop, and that was it.
I watched so many recaps of that too, to try and see, what exactly happened. And, maybe it was a lockup that prevented him. I don't know what happened, but you can't really tell. I watched so many recaps and people, were saying, well, he got bumped from behind, but it's pretty clear from the aerial view that he did not get bumped from behind. So a really big bummer for the McLaren team, because they are such a strong team on the grid. They are one of the, top performers. So a big bummer and a huge miss out for points for that team.
Yeah. And Pato did post on social media after the race and basically was like, I got mixed up and just, that's what happened. My bad. I think he said, I owe everyone a beer.
Yeah, he did. He said, I owe you a beer.
Yeah. And then by contrast, you have Rossi's post on Instagram where he literally was like, glad the weekend's over. The only good thing was how many people came out. I was like, oh, buddy, I'm so sorry. I know it's a rough one.
At least he's honest.
Yeah. He did not necessarily have, he didn't try to put rose-colored glasses on. He was like, thanks for the fans. Everything else about this place sucks and I want to leave.
Yeah, I did see that. That was awesome. And we thank you for your honesty, Pato. We really do.
Yeah, we do. And we did, other than that, have like, and that really wasn't from the start. Like, we had a pretty clean start until lap 15.
Yep.
So our first crash of 2 was on lap 15, which we had rookie Rasmussen, and he crashed basically into like the wall in turn 4, but he sort of just lost control. And one thing I did think was interesting about the kind of commentating when he did lose control, and he also he didn't take out another car, like but he did kind of take a car with him into the wall, basically. Jack Harvey, you're a victim. I'm so sorry. Like,
I felt so bad. He tried so hard to avoid it, and he just couldn't.
And there was nowhere for him to go, unfortunately, other than where he ended up.
We have to thank his instincts, though. He really did have a good idea. Car was going left. I'm going to go right, but I'm still going to get hit.
It's sort of very similar to that Daniel Ricciardo situation where he broke his wrist last season, where it was either go into another driver or go into the wall. Like,
what do you do?
Sort of similar. Yeah.
Yep.
And you take the situation that's going to take the least amount of damage or like possible danger.
Yep.
So he did do his best. He was a victim.
He did his best.
But yeah, I think that one, what I found really interesting about the commentating was, if you listened to the broadcast, they were talking about multiple drivers were really struggling with that turn specifically. And that I think it was really just lack of experience that kept him from being able to recover. And he did lose control and go into the wall. But it was a struggle turn for a number of drivers that were far more experienced.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's something pretty common. Each track has their own unique set of issues that drivers face, right? And, being a rookie, I think Christian just had that downside to it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I feel bad for him because the worst is also like every time you hear them come over the radio and they're like, "I'm okay, I'm sorry," and I'm like, "Oh, I feel so
hear
bad."
it. You can just hear it. Ugh, it's so sad.
Oh, but one of the other things though that was new this race was we switched the halo out for the sort of windshield situation, and I was curious because of a couple of things that were so different this in terms of performance. If a lot of that or any of that had to do with the new accountability for the aerodynamic change, because instead of having a halo where the air is coming through, you have now basically a windshield that it's going over.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. I knew going into it that the Arrow screen was being implemented this race for the first time. And, they have tested it a handful of times in different tracks. They've never tested it at this track. So this was the first time that it had seen it. So I think that definitely does come into play. Absolutely. It's something new, not only for rookies, right? It's literally new for everybody. So I think that's something that they had to get used to, and not something that they're technically used to driving with.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's interesting too, because it's like when you look at it, and also you look at the crashes too, it didn't shatter, obviously. Like it was probably an extra layer of protection for the drivers for anything that's flying, kind of debris situation.
Something, and I think you probably caught this, is they don't throw red flags out super easily, right? So I think that Arrow screen has a big impact on, the debris that does come out of crashes. Like you had mentioned, the Rasmussen crash, they didn't red flag that. It was a yellow flag. So the debris, and you can see it when you watch replays, there's a lot of debris coming off of, his car from hitting the wall. So in even Jack Harvey's car, there was debris coming out. So I think that's something to note is, they try and keep racing going, right?
Yeah, and it happens every IndyCar race, so it wasn't like a new level of stress. But I will say, I was like, when should they be driving still? Yeah. Do we think that that's it's
Is
like
it safe?
it feels not safe to me.
I agree.
But what can I do about that? Yeah, it's the yellow flag versus the red flag it has to be something so serious drastic, for a red flag in IndyCar.
For sure.
Yeah. Versus this, it's like this is a clear crash. The car had to be removed from the track and it didn't matter. It was under yellow flag conditions for the whole track.
We're just gonna make them go around it.
And that's fine, I guess. It's like, okay,
sure, we'll do it.
But I think that does speak to like the skill level that comes in IndyCar for the drivers, because there is no, like if there's a crash like there was in this race, most of the time it's going to be a yellow flag.
Mm-hmm.
And that means you have to not only be able to do like what Jack Harvey did, which is in the actual crashing incident at the beginning, like deciding, okay, do I go left? Do I go right? How can I minimize the damage? How can I get out of this unscathed? But then also for multiple laps after that, you're driving around a crashed car that is being removed from the track, as well as debris and all these other things. And in doing that, you have to actually be very skilled in order to not kind of cause another crash or cause damage to your own vehicle. And I think it is one of those things where it is really surprising that they're able to do that at that level.
Not only skill, it's instincts, right? It's how fast can you, in reactions, it's how fast can you react to what's going on in the grid ahead of you and even behind you, right? Because you're going to keep circling around it for, at least 5 or 6 laps, depending on what it is.
Yeah, it is. And it was, I think it was closer to 6 this race with clearing that car out. And it's also, there's a safety car on the track. There's also time for the field to bunch back up. So when we did have all of those drivers that were pushed, through the small crash between the 2 Arrow McLaren drivers and some of the other incidents that we had at the beginning, when that safety car does come out and that yellow flag is coming out, it does give them time to sort of bunch the field back up and catch up, which is cool too.
Yeah, I think that heavily played into the race results for sure this past weekend.
Yeah, I think so. This race in particular was just like kind of genuinely uneventful, which is wild to say with like a safety car, a yellow lap, and multiple laps under a yellow flag and multiple crashes. But ultimately, like it really was, once everything settled into place, not too eventful after the fact. We did have passing, but that's pretty typical in IndyCar. Like there was a lot of movement throughout the field, which is great and great racing. Love to watch it. But the one thing I did want to talk about was I thought the more exciting part was like this thing that we have in IndyCar that is called push to pass. And that, for people who aren't familiar with push to pass, is that IndyCar drivers can apply basically about an extra 60 horsepower per attempt of utilizing push to pass. And they can use that for about up to 20 seconds at a time. But obviously that is also a portion of like managing your fuel, of managing your tires, and being able to smartly apply the amount of time that you want to use push to pass, how much of it you're going to use throughout the race, and when you're going to use it, because you can have basically roughly about 150 to 200 seconds of push to pass access in the race itself. And I think watching it this time, we know Scott Dixon won the race. And I think a lot of that was him being able to manage push to pass, manage his own fuel, manage his tires, and also being aware of how Joseph Newgarden and Colton Herta were utilizing their push to pass and their fuel management and knowing how to keep ahead of them. It really was a smart and interesting kind of strategy throughout.
Yeah, I think that adds, and that's something that makes IndyCar really interesting. I think that adds another level of complexity, right? That's one more thing that you have to plan. And something else that you touched on is refueling. So, a little different than Formula One there as well, right? Like when they go in for their tire change, they're not just doing a quick 3-second tire change, right? It's longer because they need to refuel. So not only do they have to take into accountability how much push to pass that they have utilized already, but just another thing like you had mentioned with fuel management. And I just think it adds another level of complexity, and it makes it just a little bit more interesting. It's just knowing how much really goes into the strategy behind these drivers. And, like you had said, when you're leading the pack, he may have been, so far ahead for a little while, but like, we had talked about earlier, the yellow flags really bunched him up. And then, they have to count for, okay, now they're a lot closer on the grid, right? How many more seconds do they have available in their push to pass to be able to get up closer to me, right? Is this going to make a big difference? Is this going to take away that P1 spot from me?
Yeah, and there's so much like factoring that in. There's so much math that's being done. There's so much communication with your pit wall that like is explaining that to you, and being able to keep track of all of that behind you and keeping track of how many laps it might take for someone to catch you, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, that's just one more level.
And it's such a mental game. Like I think a lot of times when we think about sports in general, but especially driving, we think about sort of endurance and the ability to get all the way through a race. But so much of it, which I think this race really demonstrated, is a mental game. It's an equation of making sure you know how far ahead you are, how much the people behind you have in their ability to catch you.
Yeah, no, I actually like that you brought that up, because it's a lot. You're right. A lot of people talk about, not only physical, but like because of the endurance, right? You have to be able to last 2 hours in this car. And then on top of, the dehydration that you're putting your body through, you also need to mentally be sharp, right? You have to think about who's around you, how many seconds they've used. You have to take into accountability everything that your engineers are telling you. And you're it's just, it's something that, you watch a race on TV and you say, oh, wow, these cars are going around in circles, right? But there's so much more to it as you dig in deeper that you would just never have the capacity to really, I could never do it. That's for sure.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's like, we see so many, drivers kind of practicing with sim racing, and we talk about like the importance of that. That's something that like, we know a lot of Formula One drivers play F123 actually on live, like where you can watch them do it. And so much of that I think is about, sharpening that mental game, knowing every turn, knowing where you're going, knowing where a track can kind of give or take, and literally simulating, even though you don't have the actual track time to do that.
I was just going to say the same thing. It's interesting because, when they're doing that sim racing, they're trying, I feel like, to just make it second nature for them, right? They're trying to just learn the track without thinking about it, so that they have that mental capacity to be able to think about other things while they're out there.
Yeah, exactly. And so seeing that, I think, one of the things that we can see that in is Scott Dixon has been racing for so long that this is sort of, I believe, won the Long Beach Grand Prix before in 2015.
Yeah.
So he knows this track. And one of the things that was said on the broadcast that I loved, but I think also was what made me think about so much about this, about like sort of the mental capacity, the mental game of driving, was they said Dixon was already racing here in Indy Lights when Colton Herta was born. And I was like, oh... So it speaks to so much. It speaks to like the longevity of Scott's career. It speaks to like the youth of Colton and how promising he is so early on in his own career. But it also speaks to that mental game of being able to do that. Isn't that wild?
That I never realized that or put that into perspective, that there were drivers that were, driving on the grid, not necessarily, in IndyCar, but on the road to Indy when some of these drivers were being born. That's absolutely insane. But like you said, it shows the mental capacity that he's been through and what he's learned and how he can put it to his racing capabilities.
Yeah, I think so much, like, not even just in racing, but just in society in general, we're always like, oh, youth is the better option over sort of like, everybody always wants to frame it as like end of career, like they're too old, how much longer are they going to race? And it's like sometimes that level of experience is what you need to be able to succeed, to be able to win. So
they're clearly in the right physical state, right? And so maybe that's what their concern is. But when you, like you said, flip the switch and think about it the other way around, it's how many times have they driven this, how they've memorized this in and out because they've done it so many times. They've had, experiences that, rookie Christian hasn't had before, right? So he knows how to weave his way around all of these different tracks. And you're right, it just makes it another level that's so incredibly interesting.
Yeah. And then to be fair to Colton, he did sort of give Scott the last little push he perhaps needed, last little breath of fresh air, because in that kind of last stretch he does catch up to Joseph Newgarden, who was within half a second, I think, of catching at that time, and just give him a little bump, a little tap.
Let's just stress him out a little bit. Let's just give him a little bit of stress.
And it was just enough to knock him off the podium. So
I'm personally a huge Colton Herta fan as well. I guess that's one I didn't really mention in the beginning. I really want to see him perform really well this year. So that makes me happy on the inside. Although I am a huge Joseph Newgarden fan, so I shouldn't say that. But Joseph has had his fair game of winning. It's time to give Colton his time to shine.
Yeah, I agree. I really like Colton, and I think it's fun to watch him kind of up there really pushing for it. He did a great job this race. It was nice to see him perform in that way. I think obviously some people aren't going to love the tap because I don't believe there was a race control ruling that it was a negative or anything. It was sort of just, racing. It's how it happens.
Yeah. And I don't think there was any ill intention behind it. I really don't think that it was something he did just to put himself. I mean, obviously you do everything to put yourself ahead, right? It's racing. But I don't think there was any ill intention behind it. I don't think people should be all in a tizzy over that.
I agree. And also even Joseph was talking about it after, and he was like, I can't even say that without, and this is me paraphrasing obviously, but the intent of it was him saying essentially like, without that bump, I can't say that I would have caught, that I would have caught up to Dixon. And so with that, it's hard to say that like, this is me again, not like what he said, but to me, him saying I can't tell you with 100% certainty that I would have caught Scott Dixon if I hadn't gotten bumped. Like it was hard to catch him. I think sometimes with that, it's like, okay, so if it doesn't ultimately like affect the outcome of the race, it does affect who got P2 and P3, but it didn't affect the win. I think it's easier to call it a racing incident in that space.
I agree. I think that's a good way to look at it, and I wish everybody thought the way that you did.
Yeah, I think it's, I think sometimes I lean towards the side of like, if there wasn't a penalty, who am I to judge, right? But other times it just depends. It depends on
what driver. I was just gonna say it depends on the driver that was impacted.
Yeah, it's like, if it's my driver, well, obviously no one knows what they're talking about.
Then it's not his fault.
Exactly. It's like he's never done anything wrong in his entire life.
That's so funny.
So I like Colton. I think he has a long career ahead of him too, which is exciting to see, because when you see where Scott Dixon is and you compare that longevity of the career, it's like, okay, so in that amount of time, where are we going to see Colton at?
Yeah.
What's that going to look like?
I think something to think about too is, this was only the second street circuit on the grid so far this year, right? And I think Colton's strong suit is the straight circuit. So I think that's someone that we need to watch out for in this entire season. I don't necessarily know that ovals are his strong suit. So maybe not the 500 winner, but I just think overall in general throughout the season, there's a lot of road courses, a lot of street circuits that we need to watch out for Colton on those for sure.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing I would bring up that's interesting about this race in particular was, as we talked about Jack Harvey earlier, obviously he was about a lap behind everyone. And when he was getting lapped, he did not move out of the way. He did try to keep try to keep Scott and everybody else behind him. And so it was interesting to watch because there's not this like expectation of being let through. But at the same time, it's like, okay, so you're stacking the grid up just so you can still finish last. You know, it was like you're not catching anyone. You're just putting your space in. You're letting everybody else get a bit of a chance.
Yeah, that's funny that you bring it up because there is technically a flag that, you know, the officials can wave that, you know, signal that a faster car is trying to pass you, right? But that didn't come out. They didn't care. They said, let's let this man do what he's supposed to do and see what happens.
Yeah, they did not wave. It's like a blue and yellow flag, and they did not wave the pass flag. So he kept him behind him.
Yeah, he did. And I think that, you know, definitely helped Scott towards the end of the race, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's, you know, it's keeping that space. It's knocking things back, and it's allowing, again, things to stack back up so that you can get a little bit more competitive racing.
Yeah, let's be honest. Jack owes Scott a beer now, I think. or other way around. Scott owes Jack a beer. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Everybody gets a beer. I don't know from who.
You get a beer.
It's like we get a beer. Secret Santa, but with beers. Yeah. Just swap around until you find the guy you're supposed to buy a beer for.
You owe someone. You just don't know it
yet. Yeah, I think otherwise this race was pretty, you know, beers that needed to be purchased aside. I think this race was fun. It was a good race. It was relatively like at the end, I will say it was exciting to see if at first if Newgarden was going to catch, and then if Colton was going to catch him, and then again it really was that management of like fuel of push to pass and knowing the sort of I want like a term for it. Like it's like the grid math, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like knowing the people behind you and being able to do that and defensively drive basically from first, which was great to watch. Yeah. And I really loved it. It was a good race.
I think IndyCar races in general can get very action packed, right? And so like you were kind of saying earlier, this is on a smaller scale of all the action that we can see in a race, but it definitely kept you on your toes. Like you were saying towards the end, you didn't. Was he going to catch up? You never really know what's going to happen, right?
It really did feel like he might for a certain period of time, yeah. I will say. And like watching them actually physically cross the finish line and seeing like, okay, they're like, this is what a gap actually looks like in person was really cool to see. Because it felt close. It certainly wasn't like, you know, in Cars where he like sticks the tongue out to like finish first. It wasn't like that.
That's so funny. It was close.
There's a clear winner. Close. Yeah, not that close though. But awesome. We finished with Scott Dixon, Colton Herta, and Alex Palou on the podium in that order, which this was Scott's 57th win, which was very exciting for him. And he started the race in 8th, which was also impressive, I think, to be able to move up that much.
Not as impressive as, you know, our McLaren reserve driver here, but yes. That was really impressive. It was a good drive for Scott. You know, he's been doing really well this entire season. He hasn't yet won a race. Obviously, I mean, I guess I shouldn't say this entire season. It's been 3 races. But
race number 3.
Yeah, right. But, you know, it wasn't on my bingo card to have him winning this race. That wasn't where I was thinking. My head was not going there. So I'm happy to have seen it. I think it was really good for him in his career for sure.
Yeah. And then like you mentioned, our down the field winner this race was definitely Teo. And he moved from P22 in qualifying all the way up to P11 to finish, which I thought was just great.
I mean, not only is it great, it's absolutely insane to think about. That was his first time being in a car and he was able to do that. That's just mind-blowing.
I think he'll be on some radars for next year, and
heavily, yes.
Yeah, and the other thing too that I'm intrigued to see is we talked about this like connection that McLaren has to the F1 world and why that gives them a little bit more of a kind of advantage. And we're going to see the same to some degree from Andretti next year because they'll have F2 and F3 teams. And then on the flip side, we have Prema coming into IndyCar. And so there's a lot of shift happening where I feel like We may see Andretti try to do the same
Yeah.
where they're taking some drivers over to F2 or F3. And we may see Prema take some of these drivers like Teo, who are very well known in that space, and move them into IndyCar to see how they can perform. And so we may see a little bit of a shakeup next year that is similar to this run from Pochard.
Yeah, I like it. I think that's a good way to frame that you should become an IndyCar fan now, because things are just going to get crazier. Not only are things going to get crazier, there's going to be a lot of overlapping. You know, if you're watching F1, you should be watching IndyCar. If you're watching IndyCar, you should be watching F1, because like you said, all of those translations are going to be happening in these next few years coming up.
Yeah, I think also it's intentional, right? Because like every series has seen the sort of explosion that F1 has had with a different audience in terms of like both an American audience, a female audience, a younger audience. And I think a lot of the people think that comes directly from Drive to Survive. It comes from kind of the explosion of content creators and the different type of people who are excited about the sport and talking about it. And I think IndyCar is trying to replicate that to some degree. Like there is a level of like, they have 500 Days to Indy now, which has moved over from the CW to Netflix, which if you haven't watched it is great to get into, like meeting quote unquote, but like getting to know some of these drivers, seeing some of these stories, seeing how important the Indy 500 is. Catherine Legg was like shown in last season, and she'll be in the Indy 500 again this year, sponsored by Elf. I actually got to interview her this weekend because she was inducted. Yeah, it was after her Hall of Fame induction, so that was really exciting. But like there are all of these entry points to IndyCar that I think they're now looking at it and saying like, we promise you like all of the excitement that you have found in Formula One, we have to some degree more competitive or I don't know that I want to say more competitive. I think it's being framed as more competitive, but I think what it really is that it's like an even playing field. And so there's this level of like different race winners every race. Like
I agree.
Like a lack of dominance, I guess, is really the word.
Yeah, it keeps it interesting.
Yeah. And then there's also like, I think Indy, like the road to Indy was more willing to show these drivers' family members and like their home life. And there's a different sort of angle that I think IndyCar has here, which is kind of exciting, which is sort of like, okay, there's some familiar faces, there's some familiar names from Formula One. There's this like more interest in being like accessible, of being like a series that you can get into the paddock for $25 a day. That you can basically touch race cars if you'd like to. Like after the race, we were so close to these cars that I was like, if I literally wanted to like lick one, I could. Like, who's gonna stop me? Literally, no one's gonna stop me.
Just a little taste.
It's just, I just want to see what it would be like.
That's so funny.
But yeah, I think IndyCar has this play, and I think they're making it, which is, if you love racing, if you love excitement, if you are intrigued by like the personalities and the personal lives of these drivers, and you want to be like right up in the action, that's what IndyCar is offering you. For about a third of the price of going to a Formula One race. And I think it's going to be a move. Like, I think this year is going to be a big deal. And I think next year we're seeing series that you're seeing names that you're used to seeing in the formula racing world move into IndyCar. And you're seeing Andretti, who is like one of the biggest names in IndyCar, kind of trying to bridge that gap to Formula One as well.
Yep.
You're seeing Cadillac being like, let's, we want to be an engine provider. You're seeing American motorsports move into Formula One and vice versa. So I think it is really an attempt to kind of push that back and forth.
Yeah, I think they're definitely trying to breach that gap. And I think it, like you had mentioned, it all comes back to the accessibility and everything that you can get along the lines with IndyCar, right? So I think it's going to be interesting. Like you said, these next few years are going to be really interesting. I think it's going to grow a lot. And I'm excited to see where it goes.
I agree. I am hopeful that the ticket prices stay at that accessible point.
Yes.
That is my big request.
I think that it is such an important thing for them that I can't imagine, inflation's going to hit everybody, right? Inflation's going to hit everything at some point, but I think it's going to maintain its accessibility for sure.
Agreed. Well, the last thing we always do on these races is ask what your predictions are for the season. You've given a little bit of it, but do you have any predictions for next race or the season overall?
All right, let's think. So, I mean, obviously, I'm a McLaren girl. I want them to do well. And I think they have what they need to be able to do well, right? Like, I think their time is coming. I can see Pato being a contender for championship points. I really do. And I also think we have so many, I think there's 6 or 7 ovals on the grid or on the calendar this year, which means the majority of them are road or street courses, which means I think Colton Herta is going to gain a lot of points. And I think he's someone that we can see as a contender in the championship as well. And, 500 winner, I can't predict that. Every year I predict it, something happens and I'm nowhere near. I don't want to jinx anybody. And I don't want it to come back to me and be like, Ellie said that this person was going to win and then they went into the wall on the last lap of the race. Like, don't want that to come back to me. But it's really anybody's game. And you never know. I mean, obviously I think Alex Blow and Joseph Newgarden are powerhouses and they're going to be top contenders for championship. But I think there's a lot of diversity in what can happen on the grid. So it's going to keep us on our toes.
I agree. I think my main prediction for the season is that each race is going to continue to surprise us in terms of who wins. It's not going to be a dominant season. I think we saw that. We saw that this weekend. We saw that yesterday. It was a very. There were a lot of people who were contenders this weekend. So
I definitely don't think there's going to be a consistency throughout the season. I don't foresee that happening.
Yeah, but I agree. I hope this is also just a blip on the radar for Arrow McLaren. And that next race we're back to normal.
We are so hopeful.
We're praying for you. We're fingers are crossed. But overall, I think it's going to be an exciting season. I really do. And I think your call to all fans that if you are not an IndyCar fan, this is the year to do it so that you can be in it for next year when things really are going to get, I think, shaken up with this edition of Prema. I'm excited.
This is your time. If you're hearing this, it's a sign. It is your sign to turn on 100 Days to Indy, because that's what I recommend everybody do first is watch that show. It's going to give you a really good glimpse into, not only the personalities and, like you said, the families of the drivers, but the whole season as a whole and how important the 500 is in that road to Indy.
Truly. Well, Ellie, this has been so fun. Thank you for joining me.
I had a great time.
Me too. If people would like to find you on the internet, where can they find you?
Instagram and TikTok are my main channels, that IndyCar girl. I've been uploading some interviews to YouTube as well, slowly but surely, but Instagram is kind of my main source for all things IndyCar.
Awesome. Well, if you are looking for a source for all things IndyCar, I have to recommend Ellie as well, because I think, as you can tell, we had a lot of fun. Well, thank you so much, Ellie. I had the best time. Thank you for joining me.
Yes, thanks for having me.
As always, if you don't want to watch these races alone, you can join the actual grid chat. I host a group chat of motorsports fans where fan behavior is encouraged, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. We watch these races live together, chat about breaking news, and of course, send each other an unhealthy amount of memes. If you'd like to join the grid chat, you can do so at tandemproductions.com/grid chat. There will also be a link to that in the episode description. Once you fill out the form on the webpage there, you'll get an invite via email from me. If you want to connect, let me know what you thought about the episode, or even just ask me another question that you'd like me to cover on the show. You can find me on all social media platforms at Marissa Kamari. And one of the best ways to connect with me is if you're listening to this podcast on Herta FM. You can find me in the community section on Herta FM, where my username is just my first name, Marissa. And once we follow each other, after every episode that you listen to, I'll be able to comment and have a conversation with you directly. So again, my username on Herta FM is Marissa. As always, I've been your host, Marissa Tandon, and thank you for joining the Grid Chat.